In a world of fundamentally self-motivated, selfish human beings, how does one or a group of people organize a society in such a way that chaos is kept at bay and the individuals within that society are served and are given the ample opportunity to flourish? I'm your host, Evan. This is the Halcyon Project. Let's jump in. What are those ties that bind? How do you keep a society moving forward in a positive direction? Obviously, anything we're going to talk about here will be in a perfect world. We don't live in a perfect world. But I think, in the name of trying to think through how you can build resilient enclave communities, which is kind of what we're all about here, it's very useful to think through and talk about what a proper mix of motivating factors underpinning a society might look like. Through my reading and through my thinking over the years, it seems to me that there are primarily three main motivating factors or three main things that hold a society together, and they vary in their application, intensity, and prominence based on the culture within which they rest. Those three things, as far as I can tell, are the application of force, the institution of religion, and the economic incentive built into the country itself and the administration that surrounds it. These three forces, as far as I can figure, are fundamentally what underpins the motivation for people to engage in society. Two of them are mostly positive, and one of them is mostly negative. I don't mean that in the objective moral sense, but I mean that in two of them are additive to an experience, and one of them is subtractive. So there are societies that will place one of those three factors at the top of their, let's say, pyramid of importance, and the other two are often subordinate to the primary. And there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way to structure this, but there are some inherent pros and cons to each of them. Some of the cons are more obvious in certain structures than others, and vice versa. Some of the pros of some of these ideas are more prominent than others, depending on the circumstance. So, just to talk through what I'm getting at here, I think every society uses all three of these, at least if they're a functional and cohesive society, for any length of time. Um, the world that we live in as Westerners, whether it's European or North American or Australian for that matter, generally our highest our highest ideal in terms of a binding force that holds our society together in the 20th and 21st centuries is that of economic incentive. So capitalism, being an ism, is actually religious kind of on the face of it, but capitalism being what it is very good, or has been until recently, at allowing for upward social and economic mobility. And so the common parlance of the American dream, grow up, go to school, get a good job, work hard, buy a house, own your home, have 2.5 children, and let them carry on and do the same thing. That's basically a very good encapsulation of what I mean when I'm talking about economic incentive with regard to societal structure. The idea is that the government and the culture that surrounds it are structured in such a way that it provides the maximum ability for the individuals within the society to become both economically secure and grow their wealth. Now, obviously, if unless you live under a rock or you're extremely wealthy, it's become very obvious in, let's say, the last decade in the West that is now more of a lie than a promise. But up until the last generation, it generally held to be true, and it was generally a good motivator to keep people kind of on the rails. And maybe here's a good time to stop and say that a society effectively boils down to, when it's functioning properly, free individuals coming together to basically build something together that they couldn't build on their own. And that ultimately ends up looking like the sacrifice of freedom for the collective good. And different societies will place different amounts of emphasis on the individual freedom and the collective good. And some societies, obviously, especially ones that are more inclined to use force, this may be less of a voluntary process and more of something that's foisted upon a people. But generally, positive societies working in a positive way, it does boil down to essentially a social contract. I don't think that everything can be explained by social contract, but the idea of social contract certainly has some validity, certainly in this context. So, in the Western context, for the last, let's say, 100 years, economic incentive has been the driving force for what encourages or motivates or incentivizes people to lay down personal freedom in the name of collective engagement. Because ultimately, until recently, the laying down of personal freedom and engaging with the collective as a society had greater benefit than it had drawback. And so, yes, you do have to lay down some of your personal freedoms. If you want to have a steady job with a steady income that will allow you the ability to grow your wealth if you're starting from the bottom. Obviously, employment's not the way to grow wealth if you don't have to. But if you're starting with a job, you are rewarded for being diligent, timely, efficient, and working hard. Now, the other two, religion and force, they do play in because effectively capitalism is an ideology, and we can just debate where it comes from and what the motivation is behind some of it, but it's an ideology that underpins that economic incentive. And ideology, in most cases, as far as I can tell, are basically partially formed religious structures. That may not always be the case, but it certainly is the case more often than not. An ideology is merely a religion that is incomplete. So it gives you a framework to understand the world, at least partially, and it gives you a framework for action, but it may not answer the large existential questions. Capitalism doesn't necessarily give you meaning per se, but it gives you a framework where your meaning may pay you when it's functioning properly. So there's a religious element even in the secular West. There's several actually, but just in terms of economic incentive, that's kind of the ideological or religious underpinning behind that economic incentive. And of course, in Western countries, we do use force. It's not something people like to talk about, but it definitely exists. So, hypothetically, if you break into your neighbor's house to steal his wealth for your own enrichment, the state will come with the police. They will put you in handcuffs and they will jail you, which is an application of force. It's a necessary and it's a justified application of force, but it is an application of force. Now, force can be applied to a greater or lesser degree, and it can even be contextually identified or defined, rather, based on the severity of an offense or a crime. And so we have a mix of economic incentive, religion or ideology, and force in the West. But that economic incentive is definitely the top of the pyramid of priority for Western nations to keep their populations productive, and I hesitate to say moral, but effectively it is a method for controlling public morality, because if the state has to use force, they take away your ability to engage in that economic incentive, build wealth, and have a stable financial outlook. There are other societies that have prioritized this differently. One that springs to mind pretty obviously is any of the Marxist regimes from the past 100 years. The economic incentive they tried essentially to eliminate as a factor, um, even in the early days of the Russian Revolution under Lenin, they tried to do away with money, which worked so well it only hung around for a number of months, and they had to reinstitute some aspects of free markets in order to keep people from starving to death. But ultimately, the Marxist revolutions of the last 100 years relied on force and actually religion as their two primary drivers to keep people in line. Obviously, the force aspect is pretty bald on the face of it for anybody who's a student of history. If you didn't fall in line and if you criticized the regime, you went to Gulag or you were summarily shot. But the religious aspect in the Marxist nations or the Marxist countries of the last 100 years after their revolutions was effectively a religion of secular atheism mingled together with an idea of class, let's say class consciousness. Marxism comes a lot closer to meeting the requirements of a religion even than capitalism does in a way, because in its various guises, whether it's class based, sex based, queer based, gender based, Marxism even has a mechanism to deal with original sin and sanctification, like Christianity, though a perverted form of it. Wokeness, in a lot of ways, is actually little more than a Christian heresy, as far as I can tell. Maybe we'll go into that in another context. It's not really the topic for today. But the Marxist regimes would use force and religion, and the religion aspect, being Marxism, was basically if you were bourgeois or if you had bourgeois connections, you had original sin that had to be dealt with, either through struggle sessions or sending you to forced labor or just ending your life. And so that's another example of the way different societies have structured their incentive pyramids for their populations. Obviously, some of these are superior to others. Um, Maybe the less said about that right now, the better. But moving on, if you look at Arab states that are functionally democratic, they have religion as the peak of their pyramid of incentive, and they will use force and to some degree economic incentive as well, especially thinking about places like the Gulf states. So they have an Islamic theocratic government, effectively, depending on the nation, and they use force to basically reinforce religious standards, and that's how they keep their population in line. Which, again, in my opinion, objectively inferior to doing it the right way. And as far as I can figure, the closest thing to a right way that we have seen in the world, certainly that I'm aware of, would be something akin to the societal structure of medieval Europe. And that's not to say that the societal structure of medieval Europe didn't have its problems, it certainly did. But effectively, what you had when it was functioning at its best was a religiously oriented nation or group of nations, depending on your ancestry, where the church and the state ruled in a lot of ways hand in hand. Depending on the context, sometimes the state had more power and sometimes the church had more power, even within the same country, within the same time period, depending on what aspect of life you were talking about. And the crown had the ability to use force to stop crimes, and for better or worse, the church had the ability to use force to basically ensure orthodoxy, I suppose you would say, basically to root out heretics and to ensure that that religious order stayed stable. Now, we can debate where that went overboard, because it certainly did on both sides. But you see in medieval Europe, basically from the Black Death in the 1300s onwards up until, let's say, the French Revolution, you have several centuries of different nations, of different peoples in different climates, from southern to northern Europe, with very different genetic backgrounds, all basically oriented towards this idea of religious observance as a duty and a requirement, which also informed the way that they lived their life, the way that they farmed their land, the way that they educated their children. And there was economic incentive to work hard, um, not in the same way that we would think of it as capitalist society now, but if you worked hard, regardless of if you were a serf or a nobleman, if you worked, you had the ability to earn your way in the world. And so economic incentive was down the hierarchy, down that pyramid of incentive. And religion was at the top. Force was somewhere in the middle there. But that religious incentive basically built stable societies that resisted outside pressure, specifically in the form of Muslim conquest and interaction with the steppe cavalry throughout the centuries. It withstood outside pressure and maintained cohesive societies for hundreds of years. Now, you have basically the same structure in medieval Europe as you have in some of the Gulf states today, with a theocratic or pseudo-theocratic monarchy. But somehow it seems that you have a very different outcome. And I would credit that simply to the fact that the theology behind Christianity and Islam are quite different, despite what the mainstream might have you believe, and that the presuppositions baked into the Christian worldview, when followed as a society, tend towards building stable, outward growing, and positive, safe societies as a general rule. Obviously, there are exceptions, and I would hazard to guess that most individuals today are more familiar with the hazards than the benefits, simply because for the last 300 years, we have been educated by the dark side effectively since the French Revolution, when the bad guys took over and started writing history books, as far as I can tell. Again, maybe that's a topic for a different day. So, what's the right mix? I guess the question is a little bit manifold, because if you're talking about superimposing the right mix of religious incentive, force, and economic incentive in the modern world, it may look different in a secular context and in the context of governance at the nation level, or even the municipal or state provincial level, than it might look as an enclave society that is functioning in parallel underneath and within those systems. So an enclave community is not going to have much application of force, both because you'll have interference from governmental organizations that sit above you, and because generally in such a small context there won't be as much need for the application of force if you're properly vetting the people that you let into your enclave, which you definitely should be if you're building a project similar to that. Economic incentive certainly should be there, as much as it can be in an enclave setting. The bigger you get, the more economic incentive there will be, and the more leverage you will have. Certainly, to start, it's not going to be there. And obviously, based on what I've said here, it should be clear that I think that the way that you organize a society, certainly an enclave society within the world in which we live, is one that's primarily religiously oriented. And as an extension, being that I'm only concerned about the preservation of Western standards and ideals, it would be a religiocentric situation or community that is based around Christianity. I don't know if we need to get into the specifics of what branch here and now today, I think actually the different branches of the different branches of Christianity can all work in different ways for different reasons and in different contexts. And a lot of that, as far as I can figure, is going to be determined by your history, your ancestry, where you come from, and what your interaction has been in your own life with Christianity and its various branches. Each branch has its own benefit and its own drawback with regard to building an enclave society, but I think that needs to be the center, right? Much like a medieval European village, the church was at the center and the spire was the highest point. I think that's an excellent metaphor for the way to build something going forward, even if it's nested within a secular structure of governance in which we find ourselves today. Within the enclave community, the church should be the center, and the spire of that church, metaphorically, should be the highest point in the community that everything should be oriented towards. And so, with that, if you have thoughts or comments, I would invite you to share them in the comments below. Criticism is also welcome as long as it's constructive. Let's talk about it, and maybe we can come to some kind of idea about how this could function for small scale communities going forward. This balance between economics, religion, and force, both in the short term for getting something established, and maybe in the long term, generationally, for how this develops in the long haul. So, with that, I'll leave you, and I'll see you in the comments.